A mother cradles her baby in 1922, but when they zoom in, something feels off. Museum curator Rachel Stevens had processed thousands of donated photographs during her 15 years at the Boston Historical Society, but the image that arrived on her desk that Tuesday morning would haunt her for weeks to come. The photograph, donated by the estate of recently deceased Margaret O'Brien, showed what appeared to be a typical domestic scene from 1922. A young woman in a white cotton dress seated in a wooden rocking chair, tenderly cradling an infant against her chest. The setting was clearly a modest apartment or tenement home, with wallpaper showing the geometric patterns popular in the early 1920s. Sunlight streamed through a nearby window, illuminating the mother's face with the soft glow that made the era's photography so distinctive. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair pinned back in the fashionable style of the post-war period, and her expression conveyed the serene contentment expected of new motherhood. But as Rachel examined the photograph under her magnifying glass, following her standard protocol for cataloging historical images, something began to feel wrong. At first, she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was bothering her about the scene. The composition was normal, the lighting appropriate for the period, and the poses natural. Yet an indefinable sense of unease crept over her as she studied the image more closely. It was the baby that first caught her attention. While the infant appeared to be sleeping peacefully in its mother's arms, wrapped in a delicate christening gown with intricate lacework, something about its positioning seemed unusual. The child's head was tilted at an angle that, while not impossible, struck Rachel as slightly unnatural for a sleeping newborn. More troubling was the mother's expression. Upon closer examination, what Rachel had initially interpreted as maternal serenity began to look different. The woman's eyes, while gazing down at the child, held a quality that seemed more like desperation than contentment. Her hands, positioned to support the baby, appeared to be gripping rather than gently holding, and there was a tension in her shoulders that contradicted the peaceful domestic scene. Rachel felt her professional curiosity transform into genuine concern. She had developed an instinct for photographs that held hidden stories, and this image was practically screaming that all was not as it appeared. The more she studied the picture, the more convinced she became that she was looking at evidence of something tragic, something that had been preserved in this innocent-looking family photograph for exactly 100 years. She reached for her phone to call the estate lawyer who had donated the photograph. This image required immediate investigation. Estate attorney David Morrison met Rachel at the Historical Society the following morning, carrying a leather briefcase filled with documents related to the O'Brien family estate. A meticulous man in his 50s who had handled dozens of estate donations to the museum, Morrison had worked closely with Margaret O'Brien before her death and was familiar with her family's history. Margaret was quite elderly when she passed, 98 years old, and she was the last surviving member of her family line. Morrison explained as he spread several documents across Rachel's desk. She specifically requested that her family photographs be donated to the Historical Society because she said they contained important stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Rachel showed Morrison the photograph in question, pointing out the details that had disturbed her. Morrison studied the image carefully, his expression growing increasingly serious as he absorbed Rachel's observations. "This would be Margaret's aunt, Catherine O'Brien," he said, consulting a family tree he'd pulled from his briefcase. According to Margaret's records, Catherine was 22 years old in 1922 and had recently given birth to her first child, a son named Thomas. The family lived in a tenement building in Boston's North End, which was common for Irish immigrant families of that era. Morrison paused, flipping through several pages of handwritten notes. "But here's what's interesting, Ms. Stevens. Margaret always insisted that there was a tragedy in the family that had been covered up. She mentioned it several times during our meetings, but she was often vague about the details. She said her family had suffered a terrible loss in 1922, but that the truth had been hidden to protect the family's reputation." The attorney pulled out another document, a birth certificate for Thomas O'Brien, dated March 15, 1922. According to this, baby Thomas was born healthy and normal, but Margaret claimed there was another document, a death certificate, that the family had hidden away. She said Catherine never recovered from what happened to Thomas, and that the loss eventually drove her to despair. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. "Mr. Morrison, did Margaret ever specify what she thought happened to the baby?" "She was always cryptic about it," Morrison replied, consulting his notes. "But she did mention that Catherine used to talk about losing Thomas twice, once in life and once to the authorities. Margaret believed that Catherine had been forced to give up her son, possibly because of circumstances beyond her control, and that the family had created false stories to explain his disappearance." Morrison looked again at the photograph. his lawyer's instincts clearly engaged. Ms. Stevens, Margaret also left behind several personal items that she insisted were connected to this photograph. She said they would explain everything when the time was right. Given what you've observed about this image, I think that time might be now. The attorney reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small wooden box. Margaret specifically requested that this box only be opened if someone questioned the family photographs. It seems she was expecting that someday someone would notice what you've noticed. The wooden box that Margaret O'Brien had left behind contained items that immediately transformed Rachel's understanding of the photograph. As she carefully lifted the lid, the musty scent of old paper and dried flowers filled the air, along with the weight of secrets that had been kept for a century. The first item was a letter, written in fading ink on delicate stationery paper. The handwriting was careful and feminine, dated October 15th, 1922, 7 months after baby Thomas's birth certificate. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this, and was signed by Catherine O'Brien herself. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then someone has finally looked closely enough at the photograph to see what I could not hide. I pray that whoever discovers this will understand that I had no choice in what I was forced to do, and that they will finally tell the truth about what happened to my precious Thomas." Rachel's hands trembled as she continued reading. Catherine's letter revealed a heartbreaking story of desperation and loss that explained the disturbing elements Rachel had noticed in the photograph. According to Catherine, baby Thomas had been born with what the family and doctors referred to as complications that made him different from other children. In 1922, families often faced impossible choices when dealing with children who had developmental disabilities or medical conditions that society deemed unacceptable. "The authorities told me that Thomas would never be normal, that he would be better cared for in an institution," Catherine's letter continued. "They said keeping him at home would only bring shame to our family and suffering to him, but Thomas was my son, and I loved him exactly as he was. When they came to take him away, I couldn't bear to let him go." The letter revealed that the photograph had been taken on the very day that social workers and medical officials were scheduled to remove Thomas from Catherine's care. "I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Kelly, to take one final photograph of us together before they took my baby away. I wanted something to remember him by, something to prove that he was loved and wanted, even if the world said he wasn't. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come." Catherine's letter explained that she had been unable to go through with the forced separation. "I couldn't let them take Thomas to that terrible place where I would never see him again. I made a decision that I know was wrong, but it was the only way I could protect him from a world that would never understand or accept him." Rachel looked again at the photograph with new understanding. The baby's unusual positioning, the mother's desperate grip, the expression of anguish rather than joy. Catherine O'Brien had been photographed in the final moments before making an unthinkable choice to spare her son from a life of institutionalization and abuse. The box contained one more item, a small death certificate for Thomas O'Brien, dated October 15, 1922, the same date as Catherine's letter, listing cause of death as respiratory failure. Rachel realized she was looking at evidence of a mercy killing that had been hidden for exactly 100 years. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a medical historian specializing in early 20th century healthcare, arrived at the Historical Society the next morning to examine the evidence Rachel had uncovered. Dr. Walsh had spent decades researching the treatment of disabled children in the 1920s, and her expertise was crucial to understanding the full context of Catherine O'Brien's desperate decision. "Ms. Stevens," Dr. Walsh explained as she carefully studied the photograph and Catherine's letter, "what you've discovered here is tragically representative of the attitudes and practices of 1922. Families with disabled children faced enormous pressure from both medical authorities and society to institutionalize their children in what were euphemistically called schools or hospitals, but were often little more than warehouses for people society wanted to hide." Dr. Walsh pulled out several historical documents from her research files. The early 1920s were particularly dark for disabled children. The eugenics movement was at its peak, and there was widespread belief that children with developmental disabilities or physical differences should be removed from their families and hidden away. Parents were told it was for the good of society and for the child's own welfare, but the institutions were often horrific places where abuse and neglect were common. She pointed to a specific passage in Catherine's letter where she mentioned the official's description of the institution where Thomas would be sent. This matches the language that social workers and doctors used during this period. They would describe these institutions as special schools where children would receive proper care, but families often never saw their children again after institutionalization. Dr. Walsh examined the photograph under a high-powered magnifying glass, noting details that supported Catherine's account. Looking at the baby's features and positioning, I can see evidence of what would have been classified as developmental differences in 1922. The medical community of that era had very little understanding of conditions that we now know are manageable with proper support and care. The medical historian's research files contained heartbreaking statistics about child institutionalization in Massachusetts during the 1920s. Thousands of children were removed from their families during this period, often based on subjective assessments by doctors who believed that disability was something to be eliminated from society. Many families never recovered from these forced separations. Dr. Walsh paused, looking again at Catherine's anguished expression in the photograph. What makes this case particularly tragic is that Catherine clearly understood the implications of giving up her son. Her letter suggests she knew exactly what kind of life Thomas would face in an institution, and she chose what she believed was a more merciful alternative. The medical evidence supported Catherine's account of the pressures she faced. Dr. Walsh had found records from Boston institutions of the period showing that children admitted for developmental disabilities had mortality rates of over 40% within their first year of institutionalization, often due to neglect, abuse, or intentional withholding of medical care. Ms. Stevens, Dr. Walsh concluded, this photograph and letter document one mother's response to an impossible situation created by a society that had no compassion for disabled children or their families. Rachel contacted Detective Lieutenant Sarah Murphy, a specialist in cold cases who had worked with the Historical Society on several previous investigations involving historical crimes. While the events occurred a century ago, Murphy's expertise in analyzing evidence and understanding criminal patterns would be crucial to determining exactly what had happened on October 15, 1922. Detective Murphy arrived with forensic specialist Dr. James Chen, who brought equipment that could analyze the photograph itself for details invisible to the naked eye. Using high-resolution digital enhancement and spectral analysis, they could potentially uncover evidence that Catherine O'Brien never intended to preserve. The first question we need to answer, Murphy explained, is whether Catherine's letter represents a confession to actual criminal activity, or whether it's describing something else entirely. The language in her letter is ambiguous enough that she could be referring to several different scenarios. Dr. No. Chen's analysis of the photograph revealed details that hadn't been visible in normal lighting. Under infrared examination, he could detect evidence that the image had been taken under significant emotional stress. The mother's hand positioning shows indicators of trembling, which is consistent with extreme anxiety or distress. There are also what appear to be tear stains on her dress that weren't visible in the original photograph. But the most significant discovery came when Dr. Chen examined the baby using ultraviolet enhancement. There are subtle discolorations around the infant's mouth and nose area that could indicate several things. In the context of 1922 medical practices, this could be evidence of respiratory distress, or it could indicate that someone had attempted to soothe the baby with substances that were common at the time. Detective Murphy cross-referenced Catherine's story with official records from Boston authorities in 1922. I've found documentation that supports her account of the institutionalization process. The city records show that a Thomas O'Brien was indeed scheduled for removal from his family on October 15, 1922, and that social workers had been assigned to the case. More disturbing was what Murphy discovered about the institution where Thomas was supposed to be sent. The Fernald State School was the primary facility for disabled children in Massachusetts during this period. I've reviewed their records, and the conditions were appalling. Children were often subjected to medical experiments, forced labor, and severe abuse. The mortality rate for children under 5 was nearly 50%. Murphy found additional evidence in police records from October 1922. There's a report filed by a neighbor, Mrs. Kelly, the same woman Catherine mentioned as taking the photograph. Mrs. Kelly reported to police that she was concerned about Catherine O'Brien's mental state after officials visited to discuss her son's institutionalization. She mentioned that Catherine had seemed desperate and determined to protect her baby at any cost. The detective's investigation revealed that Catherine's fear of the institution was well-founded. Ms. Stevens, based on what I've uncovered about conditions at these facilities, Catherine O'Brien may have made a rational decision to spare her son from a fate worse than death. The question now is whether we're looking at evidence of a crime or evidence of a mother's desperate act of love. Mrs. Kelly's role in the story became crucial when Rachel discovered that the woman had left behind her own written account of the events of October 15, 1922. The Kelly family descendants, contacted through genealogical research, provided access to a diary that had been passed down through their family for generations. Margaret Kelly's diary entries from October 1922 painted a detailed picture of the days leading up to the photograph being taken. Her writing revealed the immense pressure Catherine O'Brien had faced from multiple authorities who were determined to remove baby Thomas from her care. October 10, 1922. Catherine came to me in tears today. The doctor and the social worker visited again, and they told her she has until Monday to prepare Thomas for his transition. Catherine keeps saying they want to take her baby to a place where she'll never see him again. She asked me what I would do if they tried to take one of my children. Mrs. Kelly's entries revealed that Catherine had sought advice from multiple sources about her options. October 12, 1922. Catherine spoke with Father O'Malley at St. Mary's, hoping the church might intervene. But Father O'Malley told her that the authorities know what's best and that she should trust in God's plan. Catherine left the church more distraught than when she arrived. The diary provided crucial details about Catherine's mental state in the days before the photograph was taken. October 14, 1922. Catherine asked me to take a photograph of her and Thomas tomorrow, before the social workers come. She said she wanted something to remember him by, but there was something in her eyes that frightened me. She kept talking about how Thomas would never understand why his mother abandoned him, and how she couldn't bear to let him suffer. Mrs. Kelly's account of October 15, 1922, the day the photograph was taken, was heartbreaking. I arrived at Catherine's apartment in the morning with my camera. Catherine was holding Thomas, rocking him and singing lullabies. She had dressed him in the christening gown her mother had made, and she looked beautiful, but terrified. When I took the photograph, she was whispering to Thomas that she would never let anyone hurt him. The diary revealed what happened after the photograph was taken. The social workers arrived at noon, just as Catherine had said they would. But when they knocked on the door, Catherine didn't answer. I could hear Thomas crying, and then suddenly the crying stopped. When the authorities finally entered the apartment, they found Catherine sitting in the same rocking chair, still holding Thomas, but he was no longer breathing. Mrs. Kelly's final entries about the incident showed the confusion and controversy that followed. October 16, 1922. The doctor said Thomas died from respiratory failure, which he claimed was related to his condition. But I saw Catherine's face when we took that photograph, and I know she made a choice to spare her son from being taken away. The authorities didn't want a scandal, so they accepted the doctor's explanation and allowed Thomas to be buried with his family. Mrs. Kelly's diary concluded with a reflection that explained why the truth had been hidden for so long. Catherine O'Brien loved her son more than life itself. What she did was born of desperation and love, not malice. I will never tell anyone what I believe really happened because I understand why she made the choice she did. Rachel's investigation led her to the Boston City Archives, where she hoped to find official documentation of Thomas O'Brien's death and the circumstances surrounding it. What she discovered revealed a pattern of institutional cover-up that extended far beyond one family's tragedy. City Clerk Robert Hernandez, who had worked with historical records for over 20 years, helped Rachel navigate the complex filing systems from the 1920s. Ms. Stevens, the records from this period are interesting because they often tell two different stories: the official version that was recorded for public consumption, and the real story that can be pieced together from internal documents and correspondence. The official death certificate for Thomas O'Brien, filed on October 16, 1922, listed respiratory complications related to congenital abnormalities as the cause of death. The certificate was signed by Dr. Edmund Harrington, who was listed as the family's physician. However, Hernandez found additional documents that raised questions about the official account. "Here's what's unusual," Hernandez explained, pointing to a series of internal memos between city departments. There was significant correspondence between the health department, the police department, and the social services office regarding the O'Brien case. This level of interdepartmental communication was rare for a simple case of infant mortality. One memo, dated October 17, 1922, from the head of social services to the police chief, was particularly revealing. The O'Brien matter has been resolved in a manner that prevents potential scandal and public scrutiny of our placement procedures. Dr. Harrington has provided medical documentation that satisfies all legal requirements. No further investigation is warranted. Rachel found evidence that Dr. Harrington had been under pressure from multiple city departments to provide a medical explanation that would avoid questions about the institutionalization process. Dr. Harrington's personal notes found in his estate papers show that he had serious concerns about the city's policies regarding disabled children. He had documented several cases where families were being coerced into giving up their children unnecessarily. The archives revealed that Thomas O'Brien's case was part of a larger pattern. Between 1920 and 1925, Boston removed over 500 children from their families for institutionalization, Hernandez explained. Many of these removals were based on subjective assessments and social prejudices rather than genuine medical necessity. The city had financial incentives to fill institutions and often pressured families who couldn't afford legal representation. Rachel discovered correspondence between Dr. Harrington and state medical authorities expressing his growing discomfort with the system. In a letter dated November 1922, just weeks after Thomas's death, Dr. Harrington wrote, "I can no longer participate in a system that destroys families based on ignorance and prejudice. What happened to the O'Brien family represents everything that is wrong with our current approach to children who are different." The most damaging evidence was a confidential report from the Massachusetts State Board of Health, reviewing the Boston program in 1923. The report, marked not for public distribution, concluded that irregularities in documentation and questionable medical determinations have resulted in family separations that may not have been warranted. The report specifically mentioned concerns about cases where families chose extreme measures rather than comply with institutionalization orders. The archives showed that Catherine O'Brien's case had been known to authorities as problematic, but that the city had chosen to accept Dr. Harrington's medical explanation rather than investigate further and risk exposing the flaws in their institutionalization program. Dr. Edmund Harrington's personal papers, donated to the Boston Medical Library after his death in 1954, provided the missing piece of the puzzle that Rachel needed to understand exactly what had happened on October 15, 1922. The doctor's private journals revealed the impossible position he had been placed in and the decision he made to protect Catherine O'Brien. Dr. Harrington's journal entry from October 15, 1922, written the evening after Thomas O'Brien's death, was a confession that had been hidden for a century. "I was called to the O'Brien apartment this afternoon after reports that baby Thomas had stopped breathing. When I arrived, I found Catherine holding her son, who had indeed passed away. But the circumstances of his death were immediately apparent to me as a physician. The doctor's medical training allowed him to recognize what had actually occurred. Thomas showed signs of having been given a significant dose of laudanum, a common household remedy that was often used to calm distressed children. In the proper dose, laudanum was harmless, but Catherine had clearly administered enough to ensure that Thomas would simply fall asleep and never wake up." Dr. Harrington's journal revealed his internal struggle over how to handle the situation. "I was faced with a choice. I could report my medical findings and ensure that Catherine faced prosecution for infanticide, or I could provide an explanation that would spare her from legal consequences, while also protecting her from the judgment of a society that would never understand her motivations." The doctor had witnessed firsthand the conditions at the institutions where disabled children were sent. "I have visited the Fernald State School on multiple occasions, and I have seen the suffering inflicted on children who are placed there. Many children die within months of admission, not from their original conditions, but from neglect, abuse, and the trauma of separation from their families. Catherine O'Brien spared her son from a fate that would have been far worse than the peaceful death she provided." Dr. Harrington's decision to falsify the death certificate was based on his understanding of both medical ethics and social justice. Thomas O'Brien did indeed die from respiratory failure. The laudanum Catherine administered caused his breathing to stop, but the underlying cause was not his congenital condition. It was a society that gave his mother no acceptable choice for protecting him. "I will not be the instrument of further punishment for a woman who acted out of love and desperation." The doctor's journals revealed that Catherine had confessed everything to him when he arrived at her apartment. "Catherine told me exactly what she had done and why. She said she had researched how much laudanum would be needed to ensure Thomas felt no pain. She had held him and sung to him as he fell asleep, and she was still holding him when I arrived. Her only regret was that she couldn't go with him." Dr. Harrington's final entry about the case showed his commitment to protecting Catherine's secret. "I have filed a death certificate that attributes Thomas's death to the respiratory complications associated with his condition. This explanation satisfies the legal requirements while protecting Catherine from prosecution. Some truths are too dangerous to document officially, but they must be preserved somewhere. Perhaps someday, society will understand that Catherine O'Brien was not a criminal. She was a mother who chose love over law." The investigation into Catherine O'Brien's life after October 1922 revealed a woman forever changed by the impossible choice she had made. Through church records, neighborhood accounts, and family correspondence, Rachel pieced together the story of how Catherine lived with the weight of her secret for the remaining years of her life. Father Michael O'Connell, the current pastor at St. Mary's Church where Catherine had worshipped, provided access to church records that documented her regular attendance and her gradual withdrawal from community life. Catherine continued to attend Mass every Sunday until her death in 1956, Father O'Connell explained. But according to church records, she never again participated in community events or social activities. She became what the parish records describe as a woman consumed by private grief. Mrs. Kelly's diary entries from the months following Thomas's death provided intimate details about Catherine's emotional state. November 1922. Catherine has become like a ghost. She speaks to no one unless spoken to directly, and she spends hours sitting in the same rocking chair where she held Thomas for the last time. She has asked me several times whether I think God will forgive her for what she did. The neighborhood's response to Catherine's loss reflected the social attitudes of the era. Most residents accepted the official explanation of Thomas's death and viewed Catherine as a mother grieving the natural loss of a sickly child. However, Mrs. Kelly's diary suggested that at least some neighbors suspected the truth but chose to remain silent. Catherine never married or had other children. Employment records from the 1920s and 1930s showed that she worked as a seamstress for various Boston clothing manufacturers, living in the same modest apartment where Thomas had died until her own death 34 years later. Dr. Harrington's journals provided additional insight into Catherine's post-1922 life. The doctor continued to check on her regularly, both out of medical concern and personal guilt over his role in covering up the truth. Catherine suffers from what I can only describe as chronic melancholia, he wrote in 1925. She functions adequately in daily life, but she carries a burden that grows heavier rather than lighter with time. She once told me that she sees Thomas in every infant she encounters, and she wonders constantly whether she made the right choice. The most revealing documents about Catherine's inner life came from letters she wrote to her sister Mary in Ireland, letters that were preserved by the Irish side of the family and eventually made their way back to Margaret O'Brien. In these letters, Catherine spoke more openly about her grief and her ongoing struggle with guilt. "Dear Mary," Catherine wrote in 1930, "8 years have passed since I lost Thomas, but the pain feels as fresh as it did that October day. I know what people think, that I am a woman who cannot move past the natural death of a sick child. If only they knew that my grief comes not from losing Thomas, but from the knowledge that I chose when and how he would leave this world. I saved him from suffering, but I doomed myself to a lifetime of wondering whether I had the right to make that choice." Catherine's final letter to her sister, written just weeks before her death in 1956, revealed that she had never found peace with her decision. "I am dying with the same question I have carried for 34 years. Was I Thomas's protector or his killer? I acted out of love, but love does not always justify the choices we make in its name." The revelation of Catherine O'Brien's story sparked a profound discussion about historical justice, maternal love, and society's treatment of disabled children. Rachel Stevens organized a symposium at the Boston Historical Society, bringing together medical historians, ethicists, disability rights advocates, and descendants of families affected by early 20th century institutionalization policies. Dr. Patricia Walsh presented research showing that Catherine O'Brien's case was far from unique. Between 1900 and 1950, thousands of American families faced impossible choices regarding disabled children. Many families were torn apart by forced institutionalization, while others, like Catherine, chose desperate alternatives rather than surrender their children to systems that offered no hope. Professor Maria Rodriguez from Boston University's Ethics Department addressed the moral complexity of Catherine's decision. "We cannot judge Catherine O'Brien by today's standards because she lived in a society that offered her no acceptable options. She was forced to choose between surrendering her son to an institution where he would suffer and likely die, or ending his life herself while ensuring he felt loved and safe. Neither choice should have been necessary." The symposium included testimony from descendants of families who had been separated by institutionalization policies. Margaret Foster, whose grandfather had been taken from his family in 1925, spoke about the generational trauma caused by these forced separations. "My family never recovered from losing my grandfather when he was 7 years old. He spent 70 years in institutions, and we weren't allowed to visit him or even know where he was. When I think about what Catherine O'Brien did to protect her son from that fate, I understand her choice completely." The Boston Children's Hospital issued a formal statement acknowledging the harm caused by early 20th century medical practices regarding disabled children. The policies and attitudes that Catherine O'Brien faced represent a dark chapter in medical history. We now understand that children with developmental differences can lead meaningful, fulfilling lives when provided with appropriate support and acceptance. Catherine's story reminds us of the importance of family-centered care and the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to guide medical decisions. The photograph that had started the investigation was placed on permanent display at the Historical Society, accompanied by Catherine's letter and an explanation of the historical context surrounding her decision. The exhibit, titled "Love and Desperation: A Mother's Impossible Choice," became one of the museum's most visited displays. Mrs. Margaret O'Brien's great-niece Patricia Sullivan spoke at the dedication ceremony. Aunt Margaret always said that Catherine's story needed to be told, but that it had to wait until society was ready to understand it. I think that time has finally come. Catherine O'Brien was not a criminal. She was a victim of a system that forced parents to choose between abandoning their children or watching them suffer. Dr. Harrington's descendants donated his complete journals to the Medical Historical Library, ensuring that his perspective on the ethical dilemmas faced by physicians in the early 1900s would be preserved for future research. His great-grandson, Dr. Michael Harrington, noted that my great-grandfather's journals show the impossible position that medical professionals faced when their Hippocratic oath to do no harm conflicted with social policies that caused immense harm to vulnerable families. The investigation concluded with a memorial service for baby Thomas O'Brien at St. Mary's Cemetery, where he had been buried in an unmarked grave in 1922. A headstone was finally placed, reading simply, "Thomas O'Brien, March 15, 1922, October 15, 1922. Beloved son, protected by love." Rachel Stevens reflected on the investigation's impact. This photograph taught us that historical images are never just pictures. They are windows into human experiences that transcend time. Catherine O'Brien's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society has treated its most vulnerable members, and it reminds us that love sometimes requires impossible choices. Her reflection in that rocking chair will forever represent both the depths of maternal devotion and the tragic consequences of a society that failed to protect its most vulnerable children.